My husband gave me everything a woman could ask for, except the one thing I wanted most, his heart. Every Monday morning without fail, a fresh arrangement of white and purple orchids appeared on the kitchen island before I even came downstairs. Not because he ordered them in a rush, but because he had standing instructions with the florist, filed neatly alongside his security schedules and business accounts. My favorite flowers, remembered with the same cold precision as a military operation. That was Matteo Bruno. Exact. Correct. Terrifyingly thoughtful in every way that did not require him to feel anything. I had known who he was before I married him. Everyone in our world did. Matteo was the head of the Bruno famiglia, the man who had brought 3 warring factions to the table and made them shake hands while knives sat in their jacket pockets. He was untouchable. Unbreakable. A wall built in the shape of a man. When his name came up in a room, conversations dropped to a hush. When he walked in, they stopped completely. And yet, at home, he brought me orchids. He walked beside me at every dinner, his hand steady on the small of my back, firm enough that no man in that room would dare look at me the wrong way. At a commission dinner 3 weeks into our marriage, when a visiting boss from Naples made a joke about my age that was not really a joke, Matteo set down his wine glass with a sound so quiet it could have been mistaken for nothing. He looked at the man with an expression I can only describe as the calm before an earthquake and said, "Say that again, and we will be renegotiating more than just this evening." The man laughed nervously and changed the subject. Nobody mentioned my age again. He was gentle with me. Polite. He never raised his voice in our home, never used cruel words, never made me feel unsafe in a physical sense. Every box that a woman is told to want in a husband, Matteo Bruno ticked it in permanent ink. But at night, in the darkness of our bedroom, he lay on his side of the bed like a man sleeping on the edge of a cliff. Still. Contained. An ocean of mattress between us that neither of us crossed. I would lie awake listening to him breathe and think, he is right there. Why does he feel so far away? His kindness was not love. It was a performance so flawless that even I almost believed it for a while. He was not present. The man who brought me orchids, who defended my honor, who made sure I ate well and slept safely, he was a body going through the correct motions. Like someone had given him a manual titled How to Be a Good Husband, and he had memorized every line but skipped the chapter on actually being there. I was living with a ghost who was perfectly alive, in a house that sparkled with everything I was supposed to want. And I lay awake every night, staring at the ceiling, realizing that the loneliest place in the world is not an empty room. It is a room with a person in it who has chosen to be somewhere else entirely. It was a Tuesday in November when I found the room. I had been searching for a property document that his assistant had asked me to pass along, something mundane about a vineyard in Tuscany. The east wing of the Bruno Manor was the only part of the house I had never been invited to explore, and no one had ever told me not to go. It was just quietly, consistently closed. I told myself it was for storage. Old furniture, perhaps. Forgotten filing cabinets. The door at the end of the east corridor was not locked. It swung open easily, as though it had been waiting. What was inside stopped my breath entirely. It was not a storage room. It was a shrine. The walls held framed photographs, a young woman with black hair and dark, laughing eyes. A woman who was beautiful in the way that sunsets are beautiful, fully and without apology. Her name, I would later learn, was Sophia. Matteo's first love. The woman who had died 4 years before we married, in circumstances nobody in the household ever spoke about openly. There were letters in a glass box, tied with a string. A rosary. And there, folded inside a sealed plastic cover as if it were a relic, a blood-stained lace handkerchief. On the writing desk sat a leather-bound journal. I should not have opened it. I knew even as my hands reached for it that I was crossing a threshold I could not uncross. But something in me, the part that had been lying awake night after night, searching for the answer to the distance, needed to understand. I found the entry dated the first anniversary of her death. It was short. His handwriting was the controlled, angular script of a man who measured everything, except in that moment, where the pen had pressed so hard into the page it had almost torn it. I promised her grave that my heart would die with her. I intend to keep that promise. I closed the journal. I set it back exactly where I had found it. I straightened the corner, so it was perfectly aligned. Then I walked out of the room, pulled the door shut quietly, and stood in the corridor for a long time with my back against the wall and my hand pressed flat against my chest, as though I could physically hold myself together from the outside. The orchids made sense now. The quiet. The distance. The way he looked at me sometimes with something almost warm before the shutters came down. I had thought I was competing with a ghost. But I was wrong. I was not competing at all. The competition had been decided before I ever arrived. Sophia had not just had his past, she had his future too. He had gifted it to her grave and walked through our life as a man already dead, just moving because his body had not yet received the message. I had not lost the man I married. I had married a man who was already lost. What I did next, I am not entirely proud of, but I understand why I did it. I did not confront him. I did not scream, or cry, or demand answers. Those things felt too large, too jagged for the fragile thing I was trying to hold. Instead, I looked at Matteo Bruno, truly looked at him, and I stopped seeing the cold man with the empire. I saw a person drowning in 3 feet of water, too proud or too broken to stand up. I made a choice to reach in. I started squeezing myself. I stopped asking for small things, a conversation at dinner that wasn't about the household, a hand that stayed in mine for more than a polite second. I stopped making those requests because I saw how they landed on him, like a weight he did not know how to carry. And because I loved him, in the full, foolish, open-hearted way I was capable of, I took the weight back. I carried it myself. When he came home from meetings carrying a silence so thick you could almost see it, I let him have the room. I moved around him quietly, making sure there was food he liked, that the fire was lit the way he preferred, that nothing in his environment demanded anything from him. I smiled when I did not feel like smiling. I retreated to our bedroom and cried into a pillow so that he would not have to manage my sadness on top of his own. I made myself smaller every week. Not because he asked me to. He never asked. He was too careful for cruelty. But I read his grief the way a person reads a room, and I rearranged myself to fit around it. I told myself this was love. Radical, selfless, patient love. The kind that asks for nothing and gives everything. Looking back now, I see it differently. I see a woman slowly erasing herself. One accommodation at a time. One swallow at a time. Each act of shrinking so small it felt like nothing, until I added them all up and realized I had nearly disappeared. I had made myself so quiet in his life that some days I wondered if he noticed I was still there at all. But I kept going. Because in those months, I had also started to see something. Hairline cracks. Moments where he paused in a doorway and looked at me with an expression that was too soft to be duty. A half smile at breakfast when I said something ordinary. His step slowed outside a room I was in, as if he was deciding whether to come in. I held those small moments the way a person in the dark holds a matchstick. Carefully, hoping they would not blow out. The anniversary of Sophia's death fell on a Thursday in March. I had marked it on a private calendar months before, not to track it with resentment, but because I understood by then that the day would hollow Matteo out. And a hollow man was a dangerous one, not to me, never to me, but to himself. The next morning, I came downstairs early. I found the old Italian cookbook that had been sitting unopened on the kitchen shelf. It had belonged to his mother, I had been told, and I made the food I had once heard him mention Sophia used to love. Slow-cooked lamb with rosemary and lemon. Bread pulled apart by hand, not cut. A small candle in a glass at the center of the table, lit before he came downstairs. He stopped in the doorway and stared at the table. Then at me. "What is this?" he asked. His voice was quieter than usual. "Careful. A remembrance dinner," I said simply. I did not look away. "Tell me about her dreams, Matteo. What did she want her life to look like?" The silence that followed lasted almost 2 full minutes. I counted. I sat at the table and waited. And then, in a way I had never seen before in all our months of marriage, something in his face cracked open. Not violently. Like old wood settling. Like a wall remembering it was once a door. He sat down. And he talked. He told me about Sophia's dream to open a small art school in the south of the city for children who had nothing. He told me about the way she laughed, like she had forgotten anything was ever difficult. He told me about the last night they had together, how she had made him promise to eat properly, as if she somehow already knew she would not be there to make sure of it herself. And then he cried. Matteo Bruno, a man who ran an empire, who had looked down the barrel of consequences most people never imagined, cried at our kitchen table, quietly and without shame. And I held him while he did. My arms around a man weeping for another woman, my own heart bleeding at a frequency he could not hear. I was pouring myself out to fill someone else's cup. And I told myself it was what love looked like. Maybe it was. But it was also what disappearing looked like. That night, I lay in bed and stared at the ceiling for a long time. I felt strangely close to him and utterly alone at the same time. Two feelings that should not be able to exist together, but do when you love someone more than they know how to let you. Something shifted after that dinner in March. The mansion felt different. Not warm exactly, but less frozen. He began to come home at a more human hour. He asked, once, what book I was reading. He filled my glass at dinner without being prompted. Small things. Quiet things. But I held them. It was a Friday in April when it almost became something else entirely. We were at the opera, a Verdi piece that I loved, and he had agreed to attend with the same mild tolerance he applied to most social events. We were in the private box, surrounded by the muffled gold and velvet of the theatre, when the noise started outside. Later, I would learn that a rival faction had arranged for a public disruption as a message, a warning shot dressed as chaos. At the time, all I knew was the sound of raised voices below our box and Matteo's hand closing around my arm like a vice. What followed was fast and precise. He put himself between me and every door. He moved with a feral focus I had only heard about but never seen, a man who was entirely capable of terrible things, all of those things aimed outward, all of it to get me to safety. By the time his guards had cleared the situation, I was pressed against the back wall of the corridor with Matteo's hands on my face, checking me for injury, his jaw set tight. "Are you hurt?" he asked. His voice was different. Raw. Too real. "No," I said. He looked at me then. I mean, really looked, not through me, not past me, not at the space where I was standing at me. And something moved across his face that I had only ever seen the ghost of before. His head dipped toward mine. I did not move away. We were an inch apart when the shutters came down. He stepped back so abruptly it felt like a door slamming. The warmth in his face vanished and was replaced with something cold and sealed. He adjusted his jacket. He looked away. For the rest of that night and the following week, he was a stranger. Ice polite. Correct. Distant in the specific, surgical way of a man punishing himself for something. He had almost let himself have something real. And then he chose the grave over the living woman standing right in front of him. I did not ask what happened. I already knew. Sophia's face had appeared in the space between us, and he had fled. And I sat in the car on the way home with my hands folded neatly in my lap, staring out at the moving city, thinking about how exhausting it is to love someone who is too afraid to be found. I fell ill at the end of May. A fever that climbed fast and stayed, the kind that blurs the line between sleep and waking, that makes everything feel like it is behind glass. Matteo stayed. He cancelled meetings. He sat in the chair beside the bed and managed my temperature through the night with the same precise, methodical care he gave to everything. He changed the cool cloth on my forehead without being asked. He brought broth and made sure I drank it. He was, in those 2 days of illness, the closest thing to a present husband I had ever experienced. In the deepest part of the fever, somewhere between sleep and the surface, I heard my own voice speak before I could stop it. I had no defenses left. The illness had stripped them all away. "Do you see me, Matteo? Or am I just occupying her space?" A silence followed that went on too long. I floated back under before I could hear an answer. I told myself later that perhaps he hadn't heard, that perhaps it had been only in my head. But when the fever broke, and I opened my eyes, he was still in the chair, awake, watching the window with an expression I can only describe as a man finally being asked a question he had no clean answer to. He looked at me when he felt me watching. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. He looked away. That silence answered everything. I lay there in the white morning light, clear-headed for the first time in months, and I did the arithmetic. I had been pouring myself, my joy, my warmth, my needs, my identity, into a vessel with a hole at the bottom. The vessel was not ungrateful. It had never been unkind. But it was also not receiving what I was giving. It could not. The hole was too old, too deliberate. I had emptied myself entirely to fill him up. And he was still choosing to stay empty. There was nothing left of me to give without destroying what remained. I lay still for a long time. I did not cry. I was past crying in that particular way, the desperate, hoping kind. What settled over me was something quieter and more frightening, clarity. I loved Matteo Bruno with something real and whole. But I also had a life that deserved to be lived. And I could not do both things in the same house, on the same terms, any longer. I planned it with the same quiet dignity I had brought to everything else in that house. I did not throw things. I did not make speeches or ultimatums. There were no late-night arguments that ended in broken china or broken vows. This was not that kind of story, and I was not that kind of woman, not because I lacked the emotion, but because I understood that some endings need to be clean in order to mean something. I waited until a Wednesday, when I knew Matteo had a full day of meetings in the city. I brought out the single suitcase I had arrived with 2 years ago, the one I had packed in my own apartment the night before our wedding, long before I knew what I was walking into. I filled it only with what had been mine before him. My books, my mother's silver hairbrush, the journal I had kept since I was 17, a few dresses I had bought with my own money. Everything he had given me, the gowns, the jewelry, the Italian leather shoes lined up in the walk-in closet, I left. Not out of spite. But because those things had been chosen for the wife he needed, not the woman I was. And I needed to leave as myself. On his desk, beside the pen he always used, I placed a letter. I had written it 3 times before I got it right. The final version said, "I loved you enough to help you honor your past, Matteo. But I must love myself enough to claim my future. You cannot give me a heart you have buried in the dirt. I release you from your duty to me." I picked up my suitcase. I walked through the house one last time, past the orchids that were already beginning to open on the kitchen island, past the grand staircase, past the east corridor with its closed door. I did not stop. I pulled the front door shut behind me with a soft click that sounded, in that empty marble foyer, like the loudest thing I had ever done. My aunt's cottage on the coast was 3 hours away. I drove with both hands on the wheel and the windows down and the sea air coming in, and I told myself I was allowed to be sad and brave at the same time. I told myself that choosing yourself is not the same as giving up on someone else. I told myself all the things I had needed to hear for months and hadn't said. By the time I reached the cottage, the sun was low and orange over the water. I sat on the front step for a while with a cup of tea and listened to the waves. And for the first time in almost 2 years, the silence around me did not feel like an absence. It felt like space. It felt like mine. He told me later what the house was like when he came home. He had not noticed, he said, not at first. He had come through the door at 6:30, expecting the quiet usual of our evenings, a light on somewhere, a sound from the kitchen, the small ordinary proof of another person in the space. Instead he found full quiet. The kind that has weight and texture. The kind that is not just the absence of noise, but the presence of something removed. He found the letter on his desk. He went to the bedroom. My closet was open. Most of it was still full, the things he had bought, arranged untouched. But the small details were gone. The silver hairbrush from my dressing table. The stack of paperback books by the window. The journal he had never read but had always noticed. The small, worn shoes I wore in the mornings before I dressed properly for the day. He sat on the edge of the bed. He said he sat there for a very long time. What Matteo Bruno discovered in that silence was something that no amount of duty or discipline had prepared him for. He was not at peace. He had believed, without ever examining it, that his grief for Sophia was the reason the house felt heavy. That her absence was the reason he could not be fully present. But sitting in our bedroom with Harper gone, with her specific, irreplaceable warmth removed from every corner, he understood that the weight in the house for the past 2 years had not only been Sophia's shadow. It had also been Harper carrying it. For years, he had feared the grief of his past. Now he sat paralyzed by the active, breathing loss of his present. He realized, too late, that his strength had been a lie. He had been hiding behind a tombstone. He walked through the house that night like a man taking inventory of damage after a storm, checking each room, finding her absence in each one. The kitchen, where she had cooked a remembrance dinner for a woman she had never met, out of nothing but love. The garden, where she had planted something along the south wall that he had never asked the name of. The east corridor. He stood outside the door of Sophia's room. He did not go in. For the first time in 4 years, he stood outside that door and felt not only grief, but guilt of a different kind. The guilt of a man who had used one loss as an excuse to waste a gift that was standing right in front of him. He went back to the bedroom. He picked up Harper's letter and read it again. And then he sat with it for a long, long time, a powerful man brought to stillness by the quiet departure of one woman who had never once demanded anything of him except to be seen. 3 days after I left, it rained so hard the roads south of the city flooded in places. I heard about it on the radio at my aunt's cottage, sitting in the warm kitchen with both hands around a mug, listening to the weather report like a normal person living a normal life. Outside the window, the sea was grey and restless. I did not know until much later what Matteo had done that night in the rain. He had driven to the cemetery in the downpour. Alone, no driver, no guards, which was either reckless or necessary depending on how you looked at it. He had knelt at Sophia's grave in the mud. The same man who walked into rooms and made people stop breathing had knelt in the soil in a €100,000 coat and let the rain take him entirely apart. He spoke to her. He told me what he said, later, in pieces, on different nights, in different moods, when he was finally learning how to talk about the things inside him. I thought loving another woman meant I had forgotten you. But loving her didn't erase you. You were my first great love. She became my second. And my heart was always big enough for both. He told Sophia's grave that he was sorry it had taken him this long. That grief had made him into something he was not proud of, not violent, not unkind, but absent. Walled. A husband who provided everything and gave nothing. He thanked her for what she had been, and he asked her, in the strange way that grief sometimes becomes prayer, to let him go. Not to forget her. Just to be allowed to walk forward. Then he did something he had never done in 4 years. He reached under his shirt for the thin gold chain he wore at all times, the one with the small gold ring he had bought the year before she died. The ring he had planned to give her. He had worn it against his chest like a wound he was keeping open on purpose. He held it in his palm for a long moment, rain running down his face. Then he buried it beside her name. Not as abandonment. Not as erasure. But as a returning, giving back to her memory the piece of him that belonged to it, so that the rest of him could finally, after 4 years of standing still, begin to move. He stood up from the mud. He drove home in the rain. And in the morning, he started looking for me. I was sitting on the front step of my aunt's cottage on a Thursday afternoon, reading a book I had already read 3 times because it felt safe, when I heard a car on the lane. My aunt had gone to the village. I was not expecting anyone. The car that stopped at the gate was not the armored vehicle with the tinted windows and the 2 trailing security cars I had last seen Matteo leave the house in. It was a simple dark car. And the man who got out of it was alone. He was wearing a grey coat over plain shirt. No jacket, no tie, no armor. He looked like what he was, a man who had driven for 3 hours on the chance that the woman he had failed might open a door for him. He stopped at the gate. He did not come through it. He just stood there, looking at me with an expression I had never seen on his face in all our time together. Open. Entirely, uncomfortably, honestly open. Like a man who had finally stopped performing and didn't quite know yet what his face looked like without the mask. I set my book down. I did not get up immediately. We looked at each other across the garden path and the small, enormous distance of everything that had happened. Harper, he said. Just my name. 2 syllables. But it was the first time in 2 years that he had said it like it meant something specific. Not my wife. Not a correct address. Me. I know what I owe you, he said. I am not here to negotiate or explain it away. I am here because I am a coward who was hiding behind grief because grief felt safer than loving someone new and losing them, too. I know that. I understand it now, Not just in my head. In my chest. He pressed his fist against his sternum, briefly, like the words were coming from somewhere deep and unfamiliar. You made room in our house for every part of me, including the worst parts. You held me while I cried for another woman, and you never once made me feel ashamed of it. And I repaid you by refusing to be present. By refusing to let you matter to me the way you already did. His jaw worked. I was afraid. And you deserved someone who was brave enough to love you out loud. I want to be that. I am asking you for the chance to be that. The sea wind moved between us. A gull went by overhead. I thought about the orchids on Monday mornings and the edge of the bed at night and the room with the shrine and the fever and the letter I left on his desk and the silence of the cottage in the first days when I finally had space to hear myself think. I thought about all of it, the whole long complicated weight of it. And then I thought about the man standing at my gate, not Matteo Bruno the Don, not the untouchable wall that running families and brokering peace had made him, but the person underneath all of that. Broken and trying. Showing up, finally, without his armor. Grief does that, I had come to understand. It does not only happen to weak people. It breaks the strongest ones differently. Quietly, from the inside, in ways they cannot always see themselves. And watching it break and watching someone refuse to heal and staying anyway was its own kind of heartbreak. But watching someone choose to heal, watching them drive 3 hours in a plain car to stand at a garden gate with nothing but honesty, that was something worth paying attention to. I stood up. I crossed the garden slowly. I unlatched the gate. I'm not coming back to the same marriage, I said. My voice was steady. I needed him to hear that part first. I need you to understand that what we had before, the orchids and the correct gestures and the man who was present in every way except the one that counted, I cannot go back to that. I know, he said. I'm not asking you to. I need to be seen, Matteo. Not managed. Seen. I see you, he said. And the way he said it was different from anything he had said before. No script, no management, nothing rehearsed. Raw and simple. I see you. I am sorry it took me so long to look. I do not know how long we stood there at the gate. The afternoon light was going golden long across the grass. The sea was quiet now, the morning's grey giving way to something softer. When he kissed me, it was nothing like the kisses before. The kisses before had been correct. Placed at the right moment, in the right context, at social events, at the end of evenings, once on our wedding day, before witnesses. They had been performed with the same flawless care he applied to the orchids and the defended honor and all the rest of it. They had been the kisses of a man doing what a husband does. This one was different. It was the kiss of a man who had finally decided to be alive. His hands held my face the way you hold something you understand you nearly lost. There was no calculation in it. No correct form. Just Matteo, finally present, all of him, his grief and his fear and his hard-won healing and whatever new thing was growing in the space where the armor used to be. I kissed him back with equal honesty. All the things I had swallowed and shrunk and carried quietly, I let them soften. Not disappear, but soften. Because forgiveness is not forgetting. It is choosing to believe that the person in front of you is capable of more than their worst chapter. And I believed that. I had always believed that about Matteo, even when belief cost me more than I should have paid. We stood at the gate of my aunt's cottage in the golden late afternoon light, two people who had hurt each other in the particular ways that grief and love and silence make possible, and chose, with full knowledge of the cost, to begin again. This time without the script. Without the armor. Without the shrine. This time, finally, with nothing between us but the truth. And that, I understood then, was the only foundation that ever holds anything worth keeping.